What if I told you that the man who seems most indifferent to you is actually fighting the hardest battle against his own heart? What if his distance isn't disinterest, but the clearest proof that you've become his weakness? Here's a truth that will change everything you think you know about men. When you're truly someone's weakness, they don't chase you with obvious gestures. They don't shower you with attention. Instead, they do something far more telling. They resist you. And that resistance, it's screaming louder than any confession ever could. Most people look for the wrong signs. They expect grand declarations, constant texting, and obvious pursuit. But here's what they're missing. When a man sees you as his weakness, he often does the exact opposite of what you'd expect. He pulls away. He acts unaffected. He pretends you're just another person. Why? Because you're not just another person. You're the one person who could completely undo him. And that scares him more than anything. In today's video, we're diving deep into the 6 undeniable signs that prove you're not just someone he likes. You're someone who's gotten so far under his skin that he's in full protection mode. These aren't the obvious things everyone talks about. No generic "he stares at you" nonsense. We're talking about the psychological battles he's fighting, the unconscious behaviors he can't control, and the subtle ways his instincts betray what his words refuse to say. Because here's the thing about being someone's weakness. It's not about being wanted. It's about being feared. Feared for the power you hold over his emotions, his thoughts, his carefully constructed world. When you become that powerful to someone, their first reaction isn't to embrace you. It's to protect themselves from you. So if you've ever wondered why he acts cold, but you sense something deeper, why his behavior seems to contradict his true feelings, grab a seat and stay with me until the end. We're about to uncover the truth he won't admit, the signs he can't hide, and the real reason why his silence might be the loudest declaration of all. Here's the thing about men and emotional vulnerability. When they encounter someone who could become their weakness, their brain doesn't say pursue her. It says danger. Not because you're actually dangerous, but because the feelings you trigger are dangerous to everything they've built around emotional control. Most men spend their entire lives learning to manage their emotions, to stay composed, to never let anyone see them completely vulnerable. It's not about being heartless, it's psychology. They're taught that showing weakness makes them less masculine, less attractive, less worthy. But then someone like you walks into their world, and suddenly all those defenses feel useless. Here's the secret. When a man sees you as his weakness, his subconscious goes into overdrive trying to protect him. His mind starts calculating, if I let her in, what if she leaves? If I show her how much she affects me, what if she uses that against me? What if I lose control completely? That fear doesn't make him run toward you. It makes him build walls higher than ever before. But here's where it gets fascinating. Even when he's fighting against his feelings, even when he's trying to convince himself and you that you don't matter, his body and his behavior betray him. His instincts leak through in ways he doesn't even realize. The way his voice changes when he says your name, how his energy shifts when you're near, the small, unconscious ways he still gravitates toward you, even while trying to maintain distance. Science shows us that when we're emotionally drawn to someone, our subconscious takes over before our conscious mind can filter it. His heart rate changes around you. His pupils dilate. His body language shifts without him realizing. These aren't things he can fake or control. They're automatic responses to the person who's become his emotional kryptonite. Understanding this, psychology is everything. If you know what drives his resistance, you'll start seeing these hidden emotional leaks everywhere. And once you spot them, you'll realize that his coldness isn't rejection. It's the ultimate form of self-preservation. And that makes you more powerful than you ever imagined. When you're truly someone's weakness, one of the most revealing signs is how desperately he tries to prove he's unaffected by you. And here's the thing about this behavior. The harder he tries to seem indifferent, the more obvious it becomes that you're anything but insignificant to him. You might notice he becomes almost aggressively casual around you. His voice gets a little too relaxed. His laugh sounds a little too easy, or he acts a little too comfortable when inside his heart is racing Maybe he goes out of his way to seem busy, distracted, or completely unbothered by your presence. He might even make a show of being interested in other people when you're around, as if trying to prove to you and himself that you don't have any special effect on him. This isn't confidence, this is performance. And the performance itself is the giveaway. A man who genuinely doesn't care about you doesn't need to prove it. He just naturally acts normal. But when someone is working overtime to convince you they're unaffected, it means they're very affected. They're just fighting against it with everything they've got. Science explains this perfectly. When we're trying to suppress strong emotions, our brain has to work double time to maintain that suppression. That extra effort shows up in overcompensation. His casual act becomes too casual. His indifference becomes too obvious. His I don't care energy becomes so forced that it practically screams, I care too much. Here's what makes this even more powerful. You'll notice this behavior is specifically reserved for you. He doesn't act overly casual with everyone else. He doesn't need to prove his indifference to other people. But with you, there's this strange forced normalcy that feels anything but normal. That contrast is telling. And here's where most people misunderstand. They see this behavior and think he's genuinely not interested. They take his performance at face value, but the performance itself is proof of the opposite. A man who truly doesn't see you as significant doesn't need to work so hard to seem unaffected. He just is unaffected. If you notice him trying too hard to prove he doesn't care, pay attention. That's not indifference, that's resistance. And resistance only exists when there's something powerful to resist. His overcompensation is actually the first clue that you've become the weakness he's trying so desperately to hide from. But as revealing as this forced casualness is, the next sign cuts even deeper. Because when you're his weakness, he doesn't just try to seem unaffected. He starts avoiding situations where his guard might slip. And that avoidance tells you everything. One of the clearest signs that you've become his weakness is how strategically he starts managing his exposure to you. It's not obvious avoidance. He's not running away or being rude. Instead, he becomes mysteriously unavailable in situations where he might be vulnerable, where his defenses might slip, or where the connection between you might become too intense to ignore. Think about it. You might notice he suddenly has reasons to skip events where you'll be present. Maybe he used to show up to group gatherings, but now he's conveniently busy whenever you're expected. Or he avoids one-on-one conversations, always making sure there are other people around when you interact. He might cut conversations short just when they're getting interesting, or change the subject whenever things start to feel too personal. This isn't coincidence. This is calculated self-preservation. His subconscious knows that prolonged exposure to you is dangerous to his emotional defenses. The more time he spends with you, especially in intimate settings, the harder it becomes to pretend you don't affect him. So he limits those opportunities before they can threaten his control. Here's what's fascinating about this behavior. It often contradicts his natural personality. Maybe he used to be the life of every party, but now he becomes selective about which gatherings he attends. Maybe he used to enjoy long conversations, but with you, he keeps things surface level. That shift in his normal patterns is the giveaway. Psychology shows us that avoidance is actually a form of approach behavior. When we avoid something, it's because that something has significant emotional weight for us. If you truly didn't matter to him, he wouldn't need to manage his exposure to you. He'd just interact naturally. But because you do matter, because you pose a threat to his emotional equilibrium, his brain starts creating distance as protection. And here's the beautiful part about this sign. The more he avoids deeper connection with you, the more obvious it becomes that deeper connection is exactly what he's afraid of. His avoidance isn't about dislike, it's about self-control. He knows that if he lets his guard down around you, if he allows himself to be truly present and open, his feelings will betray him. You might also notice that when he does interact with you, there's a time limit. He'll engage, but only to a certain point. Then something shifts and he finds a reason to leave, to end the conversation, or to create physical distance. That shift happens right at the moment when things start to feel too real, too connected, too threatening to his defenses. If you see him strategically limiting his exposure to you, especially ally in vulnerable situations, don't take it personally. Take it as confirmation. He's not avoiding you because you don't matter. He's avoiding you because you matter too much. And that recognition is about to lead us to the next sign, where his body betrays what his mind is trying so hard to hide. Sometimes the most honest conversations happen without words. And when you're someone's weakness, their body language becomes a constant contradiction to their verbal messages. He might be saying you're just a friend with his words, but his body is screaming something completely different. And the beautiful thing about body language is that it's almost impossible to fake consistently. You'll notice it in the subtle ways he positions himself around you, even when he's trying to maintain emotional distance. His feet might point toward you even when his attention seems focused elsewhere. He might lean in slightly when you speak, as if magnetically drawn closer, then catch himself and pull back. These micro movements happen below the level of conscious awareness. His mind might be saying, keep distance, but his body says, get closer. Eye contact becomes a battlefield. When you're his weakness, he'll have moments where he looks at you just a little too long, like he's trying to memorize something about you. But then he'll quickly look away, sometimes even seeming uncomfortable with the intensity of that connection. That push and pull with eye contact is one of the strongest indicators that you affect him more than he wants to admit. Then there's nervous energy. Even while he's trying to seem completely relaxed and unaffected, his body might betray his real state. Maybe he fidgets with objects when you're around, runs his hand through his hair more often, or has restless movements he doesn't seem aware of. These are signs of emotional arousal. His system is activated by your presence, even though he's working hard to seem calm. And here's what's particularly revealing. His protective instincts slip through despite his emotional walls. He might subtly position himself between you and crowds, slow his pace to match yours, or unconsciously create space for you in group settings. These behaviors happen automatically because protecting you becomes instinct, not choice, even when he's trying to maintain emotional distance. The contradiction is the key here. His words might be telling you he doesn't care, but his body is constantly reaching towards you, orienting around you, responding to you. That internal war between what his mind wants to project and what his body naturally does creates tension you can actually feel. Science tells us that when we're fighting our natural instincts, it creates stress in our system. That stress shows up physically. So even while he's trying to convince you and himself that you don't affect him, his body is dealing with the stress of that suppression. And that stress leaks out in ways he can't control. Here's the thing about body language when someone is your weakness. It doesn't lie. He can control his words, manage his responses, and carefully craft his image. But he can't control the way his pupils dilate when he looks at you, how his breathing changes when you're close, or the way his energy shifts when you enter a room. If you start paying attention to these physical contradictions, you'll see the truth behind his carefully maintained facade. His body is having a completely different conversation than his mouth. And that conversation is telling you exactly how much power you have over him, even when he'd rather die than admit it. But as powerful as these physical signs are, the next one goes straight to the core of how he experiences you emotionally. Because when you're his weakness, you don't just affect his behavior, you completely disrupt his emotional patterns in ways that surprise even him. When you become someone's weakness, you don't just change how they act around you. You change their entire emotional landscape. And one of the most telling signs of this is how differently he reacts to you compared to everyone else in his life. It's not just that he treats you differently. It's that you trigger completely different emotions in him. Emotions he might not even fully understand. You might notice that things that wouldn't normally bother him suddenly become significant when they involve you. Maybe he's usually laid back and easygoing, but when it comes to you, he becomes more reactive, more sensitive, more intense. Or perhaps he's normally very expressive and open, but around you, he becomes guarded and careful with his words. These personality shifts aren't random. They're happening because you've touched something deeper in him than other people reach. Here's what's fascinating about this. When someone becomes your weakness, they don't just affect your good emotions. They affect all your emotions more intensely. So his reactions to situations involving you become disproportionate to what they would be with anyone else. Maybe hearing about your bad day affects him more than it should. Maybe seeing you happy makes him happier than makes logical sense. Maybe the thought of you being hurt or upset triggers protectiveness he didn't know he had. These heightened emotional responses happen because you've bypassed his normal emotional filters. Most people interact with his surface emotions, but somehow you've gotten access to the deeper levels, the more vulnerable parts of his emotional world. And when those deeper emotions get activated, they're more intense, more consuming, and much harder for him to control or understand. Psychology explains this through something called emotional prioritization. When someone becomes emotionally significant to us, our brain automatically assigns higher importance to anything connected to them. Their words carry more weight. Their actions affect us more deeply. Their presence changes our entire emotional state. This isn't something we choose. It happens automatically when someone crosses from being just another person to being someone who matters. You might also notice that he struggles to stay consistent in how he treats you. One day he might seem warm and engaged, and the next day he's distant and cold. This isn't him playing games. This is him struggling with the intensity of what you trigger in him. When his guard is down, his real feelings leak through. When he realizes what's happening, he tries to compensate by pulling back. That creates the hot and cold pattern that so many women experience with men who see them as weaknesses. And here's the thing about emotional disruption. It's exhausting. When someone affects your emotional world this deeply, it takes energy to manage those feelings, to keep them under control, to maintain your composure. That's why being around you might sometimes seem draining for him. Even when he enjoys it, you're not just another social interaction. You're an emotional event every single time. If you notice that you seem to affect his emotions more intensely than other people do, that his reactions to you are stronger than they are to others, or that he seems to struggle with emotional consistency around you, pay attention. That's not confusion or mixed signals. That's proof that you've accessed a part of him that most people never reach. You've become the person who can disrupt his emotional equilibrium just by existing in his world. But emotional disruption is just one layer of how deep your effect on him goes. The next sign reveals something even more powerful, how you've started to occupy his mental space in ways that surprise even him. There's a difference between someone who thinks about you occasionally and someone whose mind has been quietly invaded by thoughts of you. When you're truly his weakness, you don't just cross his mind from time to time. You become a constant, subtle presence in his mental landscape. And the ways this shows up are both fascinating and revealing. You might start noticing that he brings you up in conversations where you're not really relevant. Maybe he's talking about a movie and suddenly mentions that you'd probably like it. Or he's discussing a restaurant and says something about how it's the kind of place you'd enjoy. These aren't calculated moves to impress you. They're signs that you've become so integrated into his thought patterns that you naturally become part of how he processes the world around him. Here's what's happening psychologically. When someone becomes our weakness, our brain starts creating connections between them and everything else in our experience. That favorite song suddenly reminds him of you. That random Tuesday afternoon makes him wonder what you're doing. That book he's reading triggers thoughts about what you might think of it. This isn't conscious. It's happening at a subconscious level where his brain is constantly making these connections. You might also notice he remembers things about you that seem insignificant, not just the big things, but the tiny details you mentioned in passing weeks or months ago. Your favorite type of weather, the name of your childhood pet, that random story you told about your college roommate. His brain is storing these details, not because he's trying to impress you, but because information connected to you automatically gets flagged as important. And here's where it gets really interesting. He might start noticing things in his environment that connect to you. Maybe he's walking down the street and sees something that makes him think of you. Maybe he's watching a show and realizes the main character reminds him of you. Maybe he's having a conversation with a friend and finds himself wondering what your perspective would be. These moments of connection happen because you've become a reference point for how he experiences the world. Science shows us that when someone becomes emotionally significant to us, our brain creates stronger neural pathways associated with them. That means thoughts of that person become easier to access, more likely to surface randomly, and more likely to connect to other experiences. It's like your mental presence has created permanent channels in his thought patterns. But here's what makes this particularly revealing when he sees you as his weakness. He might actually try to fight these thoughts. He might catch himself thinking about you and consciously try to redirect his attention elsewhere. He might feel frustrated with himself for how often you cross his mind. That internal struggle between naturally thinking about you and trying not to think about you creates a kind of mental tension that only makes the thoughts stronger. If you notice him making unexpected connections to you in conversations, remembering details that surprised you, or seeming to have thoughts about you pop up at random times, pay attention. That's not just casual interest, that's mental occupation. You've become such a significant presence in his internal world that his mind naturally gravitates toward you, even when he consciously wishes it wouldn't. And speaking of things he wishes he could control, the final sign we're going to explore reveals the most vulnerable aspect of how you've become his weakness. It's about the moments when his carefully constructed walls completely crumble, and the truth he's been hiding gets exposed in ways he never intended. Here's the most vulnerable sign that you're his weakness, and it's also the one he's least likely to realize he's showing. There will be moments, usually brief and unguarded, where his emotional walls completely disappear and you see him exactly as he is. These aren't planned moments. They're accidents, slips in his careful composure where his real feelings break through before his mind can stop them. Maybe it happens when he thinks you're not looking, and you catch him watching you with an expression that's completely unguarded. Maybe it's in the way his voice changes when he says goodbye, like he doesn't really want the conversation to end. Maybe it's a moment of unexpected tenderness in the middle of what should be a casual interaction. These glimpses are precious because they're completely authentic.